While the world has spent months watching Iran threaten to close the Strait of Hormuz entirely, and while this series has spent multiple episodes tracking naval blockades, parliamentary votes, missile threats, and a president who claims total control over a waterway, two of his own allied tankers just got attacked. Iran's own foreign minister quietly said something back in March that deserves far more attention than it ever got. Abbas Araghchi confirmed on the record that Iran allows India, China, and Russia to use the Strait of Hormuz for commercial shipping, not allows under certain restricted conditions, not permits with extensive delays, allows. Meanwhile, ships linked to what Iran describes as its adversaries are not permitted to pass through the strait at all. Sit with that for a second because it changes the entire picture painted by every "Iran closes the strait" headline you've seen throughout this conflict. This was never a blanket closure in the way it's often described. It has been, from very early in this war, a selective gate, with Iran itself deciding, country by country, exactly who gets through and who doesn't. And it gets more consequential from there. Weeks after Araghchi's confirmation, a United Nations Security Council resolution specifically aimed at reopening the Strait of Hormuz to everyone came up for a vote. This happened hours, not days, hours, before one of Donald Trump's own deadlines for Iran to comply or face strikes on its power plants and bridges. Russia and China, both permanent veto-wielding members of the Security Council, killed that resolution. They used the single most powerful diplomatic tool either country possesses to block a resolution that would have restored open passage for everyone. At the exact moment their own ships were already sailing through the strait without restriction, under an arrangement Iran had already confirmed publicly weeks earlier. Two of the most powerful countries on Earth spent their veto power protecting a system that was already benefiting them directly. That is not incidental diplomacy. That is not routine great power maneuvering. That is a demonstrated, concrete, high-stakes alignment between Tehran, Moscow, and Beijing, specifically around control of one of the most important choke points in the global economy. And it happened in full public view, recorded in Security Council minutes, while most coverage of this war was focused entirely on the US-Iran axis of the story. Today, I want to walk through exactly what this selective access arrangement means, how deep the Iran-Russia-China alignment on this specific issue actually goes, why it makes strategic sense for Beijing and Moscow, specifically given the current state of the global oil market, why India's presence on this same list complicates the story in an interesting way, and, maybe most surprisingly, why even some of Iran's own former senior officials are now publicly warning against exactly this kind of dependency. Here's the lens for today, and I want you to hold on to this framework for the rest of this video, the friendly fire exemption. Here's what I mean by that. When a blockade, a closure, or any wartime control measure carves out specific named exemptions for particular countries, it stops functioning as a pure security or wartime measure. At that point, it becomes something else entirely, a tool of alliance building, a mechanism for rewarding loyalty, a lever for shaping which countries bear the economic cost of a conflict, and which countries are shielded from it. Iran isn't simply denying the world access to the Strait of Hormuz as an act of self-defense against enemies. It is actively using selective access as leverage, rewarding the specific countries willing to maintain relations with Tehran despite years of sanctions and international pressure, while deliberately concentrating the economic pain of this standoff onto countries aligned with Washington and its allies. That's a fundamentally different kind of blockade than a total indiscriminate closure would be. And once you see it through that lens, it tells you an enormous amount about where Iran's actual strategic priorities sit, not in the abstract, but in the very specific, very concrete decisions about which ships get waved through and which ones get turned away. Now let's lay out the full documented sequence here, because the timeline itself tells a story that most single-day news coverage misses entirely. On March 25, 2026, Iran circulated a formal letter to the International Maritime Organization, the United Nations body responsible for regulating international shipping, stating that foreign ships could cross the Strait of Hormuz as long as they weren't supporting acts of aggression against Iran and followed regulations Tehran had put in place. This alone was a notable move, Rather than simply issuing military threats or radio warnings, Iran was working through an internationally recognized regulatory body to formalize its claimed authority over passage through the strait. The very next day, March 26th, Araghchi went further and named names. He confirmed specifically that India, China, and Russia were among the friendly nations being granted continued access, while vessels linked to Iran's adversaries were explicitly barred from the waterway. This was roughly 4 weeks after the war itself began on February 28th, which means this selective access framework was established remarkably early in the conflict, well before most of the institutional machinery this series has covered in later episodes even existed. Fast forward roughly 2 weeks to April 7th, 2026. Trump had issued a specific ultimatum: reopen the strait by 8 p.m. Eastern that evening, or face American strikes on Iranian power plants and bridges. Hours before that deadline was set to expire, the UN Security Council took up a resolution specifically designed to force the reopening of Hormuz to all shipping. Russia and China vetoed it. And as this series has extensively documented in the months since, the establishment of Iran's Persian Gulf Strait Authority in May, the parliamentary Hormuz security votes covered in earlier episodes, National Security Chief Mohsen Rezai's expanded list of conditions, the renewed strait closure declaration following the collapse of the June Memorandum of Understanding, and Trump's own escalating rhetorical claims, culminating in his stated intention to declare the strait U.S. territory. Iran's institutional and legal claim over the strait has done nothing but harden in the months following that original March framework. The selective access policy wasn't a temporary early war improvisation that got abandoned as the conflict evolved. It was the opening move in a strategy that has only become more entrenched and more formally institutionalized as this war has ground on. It's worth pausing here to note just how unusual this is historically. The Strait of Hormuz has been a flashpoint in Middle Eastern geopolitics for decades, going back to the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, when both countries attacked oil tankers in what became known as the Tanker War, and continuing through periodic tensions in the 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s over Iranian threats to close the strait in response to sanctions or military pressure. But in almost every previous episode of Hormuz tension across that long history, the threat was framed as universal. A closure or a threatened closure that would apply indiscriminately to all shipping regardless of origin. What makes this current conflict different, and what this series keeps returning to, is that Iran's approach this time has never actually been universal. From the earliest weeks, it built in exceptions, and those exceptions map almost perfectly onto Iran's broader geopolitical alignment. Let's slow down and be genuinely precise about the exact language Iran's own government used here, because in diplomacy, and especially in a conflict this closely scrutinized, specific word choices carry real weight. And this particular choice of words tells you a great deal about Iran's actual strategic thinking. Araghchi stated that Iran had allowed India, and in his own words, a number of other friendly nations, including China and Russia, to continue using the strait for commercial shipping. He made explicitly clear, in the same set of remarks, that ships linked to Iran's adversaries would not be permitted to transit the waterway under any circumstances. Now notice the specific category Araghchi chose: friendly nations. This is not a neutral technical security-based classification like vessel type, cargo manifest, flag registry, or insurance carrier, categories a government might reasonably use to screen shipping traffic for genuine security reasons during an active war. Friendly nations is an explicitly relational political category. It sorts the entire population of global shipping traffic attempting to move through this critical choke point based fundamentally on each individual country's broader diplomatic and economic relationship with Tehran, not on anything specific to the individual vessel, its cargo, or its actual behavior. That distinction matters enormously. A security-based screening policy would, in principle, apply consistent criteria regardless of which country a ship happens to be registered in or trading with. A relationship-based policy, by contrast, is explicitly designed to reward certain governments and punish others, using access to one of the world's most economically vital waterways as the actual mechanism of reward and punishment. Iran is, in effect, using Hormuz as a geopolitical loyalty test, administered in real time, ship by ship, country by country. This is a policy choice with obvious and fairly transparent strategic intent behind it. It rewards countries that have maintained meaningful economic and diplomatic ties with Iran despite years of international sanctions, immense diplomatic pressure, and, over the course of this specific war, direct military conflict with the United States and Israel. At the same time, it deliberately concentrates the economic and logistical cost of this standoff specifically onto countries aligned with Washington and its allies, whose shipping either faces outright denial of passage or, at minimum, dramatically increased risk, delay, and insurance cost compared to the friendly nations enjoying continued access. It's also worth asking why Iran chose to formalize this through a letter to the International Maritime Organization specifically, rather than simply issuing unilateral military warnings, as the IRGC has done at various other points throughout this conflict covered elsewhere in this series. Going through the IMO, an internationally recognized regulatory body that virtually every maritime nation on Earth interacts with as a matter of course, gave Iran's selective access policy a veneer of procedural legitimacy that a purely unilateral military declaration would have lacked. It's a subtle but meaningful difference. Rather than simply threatening to attack ships it doesn't like, Iran attempted, from the very start, to frame its selective control of the strait as a matter of formal international shipping regulation filed through the correct bureaucratic channel, rather than as an act of wartime coercion. Here's where the story gets more layered, and where I think most coverage of this specific announcement missed something interesting: India's presence on this exact same list. Unlike China and Russia, India doesn't fit neatly into the anti-Western bloc framing that's easy to apply to this story at first glance. India has, for years, maintained an increasingly close strategic and defense relationship with the United States, participates in security dialogues explicitly oriented around balancing China's regional influence, and has generally positioned itself as a partner to Washington on most major global issues, even while maintaining historical non-alignment instincts on others. So why would Iran extend the same friendly nation designation to India as it does to China and Russia? The most straightforward explanation is India's enormous and continuing dependence on energy imports generally, and its historical relationship with Iranian oil specifically, predating the current sanctions regime by decades. India has consistently tried to maintain independent, pragmatic relationships with oil-producing nations, regardless of those nations' broader standing with Washington, continuing to purchase discounted Russian oil throughout the Ukraine war despite Western pressure to reduce that trade, for instance. Iran, including India in this friendly nations category, likely reflects a similar pragmatic calculation. India represents a massive, reliable market for energy exports that has consistently resisted fully aligning its trade policy with Washington's preferences, even while maintaining a broader strategic partnership with the United States on other fronts. This matters for the broader story because it complicates any simple Iran plus its anti-Western allies versus everyone else framing. India's inclusion suggests Iran's selective access criteria are, at least in part, genuinely pragmatic and economic, rather than purely ideological or bloc-based. Tehran isn't just rewarding countries hostile to the United States. It's rewarding any country willing to maintain substantial economic engagement with Iran, regardless of that country's other alliances. That's a more transactional, interest-based calculation than a simple axis of resistance versus the West narrative would suggest, even though the China and Russia components of this same list clearly do carry that additional geopolitical weight. It's also worth pausing on the timing here specifically, because it reframes everything this series has covered about Iran's Hormuz strategy in later months. This selective framework was in place as early as March 2026, meaning it predates the formal establishment of the Persian Gulf Strait Authority in May by roughly 2 months, predates the Parliamentary Hormuz Security Commission's unanimous vote covered in an earlier part of this series by roughly 4.5 months, and predates Rezai's expanded conditions tying the strait's reopening to the resolution of conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon by roughly 5 months. The selective access strategy wasn't a late-stage refinement. It was baked into Iran's approach from essentially the very beginning of this conflict. Now let's turn to the moment where this quiet, relatively low-profile selective access arrangement became formally, publicly, and dramatically visible on the world stage, recorded permanently in the official minutes of the United Nations Security Council. On April 7, 2026, with Trump's own deadline for Iran to reopen the strait set to expire that very evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, or face American strikes specifically targeting Iranian power plants and bridges, the UN Security Council took up a resolution aimed directly at forcing the reopening of Hormuz to international shipping. Russia and China, both permanent members of the Council with veto power, killed it. It's worth walking through exactly how watered down this resolution had already become by the time of the actual vote, because the degree of dilution makes the eventual veto even more striking. Earlier drafts had included explicit Security Council authorization for the use of force to reopen the strait, and had extended coverage beyond the strait itself to adjacent waters. But after Russia, China, and France, all three veto-wielding powers, expressed opposition to approving any use of force whatsoever, the resolution was revised. All references to offensive action were eliminated entirely. The revised language would have authorized only, in the resolution's own words, all defensive means necessary. Even that wasn't enough to secure passage. Before the actual vote, the resolution was weakened even further. Any reference to formal Security Council authorization for action was removed entirely, and its scope was narrowed to cover only the Strait of Hormuz itself. By the time this resolution actually came up for a vote, it had already been stripped down to something close to a symbolic statement. No offensive force authorized, no binding order attached, narrowly scoped, purely defensive. And even that diluted version could not clear the veto from Moscow and Beijing. The resolution received 11 votes in favor and 2 against, Russia and China specifically, with Pakistan and Colombia abstaining. U.S. Ambassador Mike Waltz's response at the time was pointed and direct. He stated that no one should tolerate the global economy being held, in his words, at gunpoint, but noted plainly that Russia and China had done exactly that by blocking even this minimal, defensively scoped resolution. Think about what it actually took for Russia and China to justify blocking this specific resolution, given how far it had already been watered down before the vote. This wasn't a resolution authorizing military force against Iran. It wasn't a resolution demanding regime change, or even explicitly condemning Iran's broader conduct in the war. It was, in its final form, a narrowly scoped, purely defensive measure aimed at restoring open shipping access through one specific waterway, the kind of resolution that, under almost any other circumstances involving a different country's blockade of international shipping, would likely have passed with broad international consensus, precisely because it had already been negotiated down to something so minimal. The fact that Russia and China were still unwilling to let even this pass tells you the underlying stakes, from Beijing's and Moscow's own perspective, were considerably higher than the resolution's diluted text alone would suggest. They weren't blocking a sweeping intervention. They were blocking the restoration of open, unrestricted access for everyone, which, given what we know from Araghchi's March statement, would have specifically eliminated the preferential access advantage their own shipping was already enjoying under Iran's friendly nations framework. It's also worth situating this specific veto within the broader pattern of how Russia and China have used their Security Council power throughout other recent international crises. Both governments have, in various contexts, demonstrated a consistent pattern of using veto power specifically to protect allied or economically important governments from binding international action, even at real reputational cost. What makes this particular veto notable within that broader pattern is how directly and traceably it connects to a concrete, named commercial arrangement. Aragchi's own public confirmation weeks earlier of exactly which countries were receiving preferential treatment. Most vetoes of this kind involve some degree of plausible deniability about the underlying motivation. This one has an unusually direct paper trail connecting the diplomatic action to the material benefit it protected. Let's step back and think carefully through the actual strategic calculus here. Consider first the basic economic backdrop. As of mid-August 2026, global oil supply was forecast to fall by 4.3 million barrels a day, down to roughly 102 million barrels, a considerably sharper drop than had been projected just a month earlier, driven by combined losses stemming from disruption in the Middle East and from Russia's own sanctioned oil exports being constrained elsewhere. In an environment where global oil supply is tightening this significantly, guaranteed and unrestricted passage through one of the world's most important oil shipping choke points becomes an enormously valuable strategic asset. Every barrel of oil that can move reliably through Hormuz, specifically because of a country's friendly nation status, while adversarial nations' shipping faces restriction, delay, or outright denial, represents a direct, measurable competitive advantage. For China specifically, this connects to a much longer-standing strategic priority Chinese officials have discussed openly for years. What's often called the Malacca Dilemma, China's structural vulnerability from depending so heavily on maritime choke points for the bulk of its energy imports. China has spent well over a decade working to diversify and secure its energy supply chain specifically in response to this vulnerability, cultivating long-term supply relationships with oil-producing nations, willing to maintain trade despite Western sanctions pressure, including Iran. Guaranteed access to Iranian oil specifically at a moment when American-aligned nations face restricted or blocked passage through the exact same waterway is a direct, tangible payoff from years of deliberately cultivating a relationship with Tehran as insurance against exactly this kind of supply disruption scenario. For Russia, the calculus runs in a closely related but distinct direction. Russia's own oil exports have faced years of sanctions pressure and price caps imposed by Western governments in response to the war in Ukraine, forcing Moscow to develop alternative shipping and insurance arrangements specifically designed to route around Western-imposed restrictions. Continued reliable access to alternative shipping routes and trading partnerships, including through waterways like Hormuz, where Iran has explicitly extended friendly nation status to Russian shipping, represents an ongoing lifeline for a Russian oil export sector that has had to work increasingly hard to route around Western-imposed restrictions since 2022. This connects directly to a separate detail worth noting. A reported oil spill from a sanctioned tanker, specifically carrying Russian crude reached beaches in Oman's Ras Madraka region during this same general period. Direct physical evidence of exactly the kind of sanctioned Russian oil trade that continued, uninterrupted maritime access through this region helps sustain. Blocking a UN resolution that would have restored fully open, unrestricted access to the strait for every country equally isn't really about Russia and China defending some abstract principle of Iranian sovereignty. It's about preserving a specific, measurable commercial and strategic advantage that a genuinely reopened, non-discriminatory strait would immediately eliminate. There's also a broader signaling dimension. By using their veto power specifically to protect this arrangement, Russia and China are sending a clear message to every other country calculating how to position itself relative to this conflict about the tangible benefits available to nations willing to maintain relationships with Iran despite Western pressure. Here's where this story gets genuinely more complicated than a simple, unified Iran-Russia-China axis narrative. Mohammad Javad Zarif, Iran's former foreign minister, deeply involved in negotiating the original 2015 nuclear agreement covered earlier in this series, has publicly staked out a position that directly complicates the picture of Iran as simply and uncomplicatedly aligned with Moscow and Beijing. Zarif has argued Iran needs to use Hormuz as leverage, but specifically warned against keeping it closed or selectively restricted in a way that risks turning the broader international community against Iran. He suggested Iran should build a genuine coalition with Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Pakistan, Qatar, Oman, Indonesia, and Malaysia, while separately rebuilding its relationship with Europe. Several of these countries, Saudi Arabia and Qatar in particular, have been covered elsewhere in this series as the primary Gulf mediators, whose direct pressure reportedly stopped a major planned U.S. strike. On Russia and China specifically, Zarif's language was pointed. Cooperation should be based on the intrinsic value of these relationships, not on Iran's need or weakness. He's not rejecting the relationship outright. He's warning against a relationship built and sustained primarily out of necessity rather than genuine shared strategic interest. That's a former foreign minister warning his own government against becoming strategically dependent on Moscow and Beijing purely as a byproduct of Iran's current weakened position, echoing, in some ways, Iran's own historical caution about overdependence dating back to its isolation during the Iran-Iraq War, when Tehran had to rely on a narrow set of willing suppliers with little leverage to negotiate favorable terms. Worth noting, Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei replaced his representative to Iran's Supreme National Security Council in early August. Another data point in the leadership reshuffle this series has tracked and plausibly connected to exactly this kind of internal debate, though that connection remains circumstantial rather than confirmed. Let's steelman the case that this entire arrangement is simply pragmatic wartime diplomacy. Countries have always maintained different relationships with different trading partners, and favoring nations that haven't participated in sanctions or military action against you is a defensible policy choice during a war being fought for survival. India's inclusion on this list further supports this pragmatic reading. A purely ideological bloc wouldn't naturally include a country as closely aligned with U.S. strategic interests as India generally is. And Zarif's own position isn't a rejection of the Russia-China relationship, just a warning about its basis. But here's what that measured reading doesn't fully resolve. The UN veto wasn't a minor, low-cost diplomatic favor. It was Russia and China spending their single most powerful available tool to block even a heavily diluted, purely defensive resolution at the exact moment doing so protected their own preferential access, in a market tightening in ways that made that access measurably more valuable. That combination describes something more concrete and higher stakes than ordinary trade diplomacy. Watch whether Zarif's coalition proposal gains any real traction inside Iran's foreign policy establishment. Watch whether China's or Russia's shipping access changes as the PGSA, the parliamentary provisions, and Rezai's conditions continue evolving. Watch whether India's position evolves into more than a purely commercial arrangement, given how central the India-US partnership has become to American Indo-Pacific policy. And watch the Supreme National Security Council for any further sign of a shifting internal balance. So here's where this actually leaves us. Iran has operated a selective access policy at the Strait of Hormuz since March 2026, rewarding China, Russia, and India with continued shipping access while blocking adversary-linked vessels entirely. When a UN resolution tried to reopen the strait for everyone, Russia and China vetoed it, protecting a real and increasingly valuable advantage. India's inclusion complicates any purely ideological reading. And inside Iran's own establishment, a former foreign minister is warning that leaning this hard on Moscow and Beijing out of necessity could become a liability rather than a strength. Let me know in the comments, smart wartime alliance or a dependency Iran will eventually regret?